Welcome to PMR, Paleo Magazine Radio, where we bring you paleo nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle perspectives from both the experts and the everyday. PMR is brought to you by Paleo Magazine, the first and only print magazine dedicated to the paleo lifestyle, and is hosted by Tony Federico.
All right, so you're reading the paleo books. You know you need to work out. You know you want to do some primal movement patterns. You know you want to go run barefooted. You're getting down into your grok squat, but you're still sitting for hours a day. Is that daily dose of movement enough to fundamentally change the dynamic of your physical structure and ultimately your health and well-being? Well, today's guest, author, podcaster, scientist, mom, blogger, really just physical movement extraordinaire, Katy Bowman, is going to blow up a lot of myths about physical movement and about exercise and how it's not just enough to go to the gym. You really have to incorporate this stuff into your daily life. It has to become part of the fabric of your existence to change your tissue on a fundamental level. I think you're really going to love this conversation. And then in the second half of this show, we're going to bring Russ Crandall back for an installment of The Ancestral Table. Russ has got a new book out. It's called Paleo Takeout. This thing's going to blow your minds. It's your restaurant favorites recreated, tacos, Chinese food, all that good stuff, lovingly and accurately recreated to fit your paleo lifestyle. So take off your shoes and start walking. Paleo Magazine Radio starts now. All right, everybody, I'm here with Katy Bowman. Katy is the author of Move Your DNA, a book that I've personally been really enjoying. It's inspired me to take the path, perhaps more irregular. I don't know, I guess the less traveled path, the side of the sidewalk that's got grass and bumps and hills and holes, all that good stuff. It'll probably make more sense what I'm talking about when we actually talk to Katy. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's funny. I actually haven't had anybody on the podcast who has had an audiobook that I've listened to that they actually did the audio for.
Oh,
so
okay.
I feel like I'm speaking to your audiobook. You know, after having listened to your voice for several hours already, it's like the book is talking to me. This is amazing.
We are in a relationship. This is a virtual, yes, very much.
Awesome. So before we get into the details of Move Your DNA, which is really an excellent book, and I think what it does that's unique is it casts exercise and movement in a light that is rarely seen in the standard fitness worlds and even in the paleo world. But before we do that, I wanted to take some time to establish your background and give you a way to introduce yourself to our audience, who you are, what you do, and how you got interested in exercise and movement and all of this cool stuff.
I'm a biomechanist. So biomechanist is someone who studies forces of tissues, of biological systems. There's biomechanists who study everything. I study humans, specifically human movements and disease. How I got interested in it, I started as a mathematician and then a physicist. And then, as I was working my way through college, it was pretty boring. And I was not a natural mover. I was not a mover throughout my life, as you know, from listening to Move Your DNA. But I became one maybe at the end of my high school years. And I had just become, it's kind of like a born again mover after being such a sedentary. Mover. Yes, after being such a bookworm my entire life. I found physics and math fairly boring because it didn't really pertain to anything. Everything was just in a book, and I had found this program called biomechanics as an undergrad that just allowed me to marry the two. So I think my interest in biomechanics, and again, biomechanics is a very broad field that could include things like robotics to replace arms or limbs, like prosthetics will employ biomechanists, to sports, analyzing pitches and how to pitch with more accuracy and less injury. But I became really interested in cellular biomechanics after going through, the same general coursework of rigid body mechanics and looking at, things like gymnastics and which body segments perform different sports better. People with different body, anthropometric dimensions is the appropriate term, perform different sports better. I, dabbled in that for a little while. But when I went back to graduate school, I was just really interested in explaining movement on a more nuanced level, on a more cellular level, it turned out to be, which is, again, what is the crux of Move Your DNA, and then just really breaking down this idea of exercise and comparing it to this idea of movement. And now I am really interested in working to find the mechanical equivalent to dietary nutrients. So what are the mechanical nutrients? What are the kind of loads that the human body requires? If you've been, reading the news in the movement world, there's this idea of dose. Nothing is really inherently good at any amount. Like you can take even the healthiest ideal food, and if you consume only that or consume excessive levels of that, you will experience disease in the same way that if you consumed none of it. So this idea of a continuum or a dose, if you will, is well established, but there haven't been studies that look at movement in the same way. I mean, we've only been looking at nutrition this way for, modern nutrition is, relatively new, and it stems from maybe 500 years of trying to figure out what the nutrients are. So I'm hoping to do the same thing for mechanical nutrients, probably from now until I die, which will be hopefully a long time from now.
You found the thing that interested you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was my arc. And then I had 2 kids along the way, and I,
just a little pit stop for.
Right, exactly.
I'm sure that changed the way you moved for a time being.
Well, and it also gave me a really good laboratory data, if you will, on watching humans come out where I haven't really done any modern intervention, which are the things that, in the paleo world, you're comparing cross-cultural data, you're looking at modern hunter-gatherers and information that's been extrapolated from more ancient civilizations. And I am fortunate enough to have 2 of my own subjects. I can put myself through the rigors as we do, but I
voluntary or involuntary subjects.
Well, totally voluntary, because right. I mean, is any of childhood voluntary? I don't know. Yeah. I'm not sure, but yes. So it's been fun.
Cool. There's certainly worse things that you could subject your kids to than exercise and movement. Now, I wanted to just take a step back for a second, because I've taken biomechanics classes. I have my undergraduate degree in exercise science, and what I recall from that experience was a very kind of distilled version of human movement, where you're trying to figure out the vector of a force, moving through a muscle. And like you said, studying robotics, it almost felt like the human body was treated in a very robotic way. Now, that was in undergraduate introduction to biomechanics. I'm sure that's where it starts. I'm just kind of curious how you got to your point where you're looking at cells. How do you actually look at a cell and study these things? What were the experiments that you did that started to spark this awareness in you to go down the current path that you're on?
All intro level biomechanics starts with it's a simple model. It's just that the model is really easy. It's like the human body is made of, in this experiment, it'll be 4 parts. It'll be like a lower leg segment. It's just segmentation. It's reductionism. It's across the board in science, because it's very difficult to make models that contain every single part. And to be clear, I am not a cellular biologist researcher. Like, I'm not actually constructing models and researching them as much as I am working from the body of information that other people are putting out. So if you took more biomechanics classes, and if you studied biomechanics at a graduate level, you would get more nuanced levels of models. Your models would then include things like cells, And so it's just about how deep you go into a science, right? You start with nutrition and you get a little bit, and then the more classes you take, they're like, okay, well, it turns out that oranges don't only have vitamin C and fiber. Exactly. They also have this and that. So you just get more variables the longer you study. But I would say about 20 years ago, well, gosh, it goes back probably hundreds of years ago, the original biomechanists, right, were Leonardo da Vinci and Newton. They weren't held to the nuanced field, right? There wasn't like these fields where you would go study and you could only study within your field. Yeah,
they're big picture guys.
Well, because little pictures didn't really exist. We didn't have an infrastructure that depended on a bunch of little pictures. Everyone was just trying to figure out nature. And so you would just think about it and try to solve it. You weren't pulling from other people's toolboxes because there wasn't this mass ability to gather everyone's tools or ideas, so
no internet.
There was no internet. There was no way to pull up 72 other pieces of the puzzle that people had been working on for a long period of time. Like Wolff's Law, he was a guy who was looking at like the health of bone and was like really trying to figure out this kind of nuanced, like load matters when it comes to maintaining density of the bone. But then there seemed to be when I think it kind of lines up with when things like microscopes were coming out, when people were able to see things at a smaller level, then study of the body kind of went from forces, which is where it was in the beginning, because these guys were forces guys. They were looking at the body from a physics perspective, where the shift towards human study started to go by the cellular model in terms of like chemistry. So once they're able to look at chemistry and it became kind of like the darling science. And so physical forces kind of fell away as information about the body was compiled. So you have anatomy and you've got human biology and anatomy and physiology, but they are almost all of the models used for anything that you would take even now at a university level to understand human body function, cellular function is force free, because they tried to simplify the model. So everyone just kind of got this picture of how the body worked where forces were not included, which is a big deal.
Almost as if you're studying a body out in space where it's just sort of floating around and nothing's acting on it.
Right. It's a parts model. Again, it's not that it was wrong per se. It was like a reduction to make study easier, but then no one ever put the pieces back together. So even just maybe like 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, did biologists discover that gravity affects cells. And the scientist interviewed was like, we just never thought, totally blowing me away that gravity would affect cells, even though you've got astronauts in space who can't survive there very long because their physiology can't withstand force-free, or a hypogravity for a long period of time. So 20 years ago, everyone's like, hey, these models, let's start introducing some forces back into these models. And now, there's this idea that forces matter in a big way. They are a part, in the same way that your TV just sits there not working if it's not plugged in. Even though the part is invisible, it doesn't work without the part. This other part being that, gravity is a constant force, as you know from your biomechanics class in the vector gravity labeled
I'm feeling it right now. I mean,
right? You feel it right now? But the amount that you feel it changes based on your position, or where you feel it changes based on position. And so that's really what my work is specifically looking at, is how movement, the variation of movement, the skeletal arrangement of your body is changing for all forces, gravity being one of them that's most easily understood by gravity is acting on your body, but if you lay down in a bed, you're going to have a different cellular outcome than if you stand up against gravity. Gravity is happening in both cases to the same extent in an equation, but functional gravity is different depending on your position, which is why NASA pays people a lot of money to lay down in bed for a long period of time so they can do research and apply it to their astronauts up in space. Because laying down is a hypogravity situation. It's a simulation of hypogravity.
I kind of thought of that image as gravity washing over us in different directions. Almost like if you're standing in the ocean, a fish probably doesn't think a whole lot about the ocean, but there's currents and it's impacting it in different ways. Since we just exist within it, we tend to take it for granted. Now, it's interesting that you're saying how the scientific study of the human body was really looking at cells and tissues and various body structures in this vacuum where there was no force acting on the cell or acting on the structure. But at the same time, we have this whole exercise movement where people are going for jogs and people are lifting weights, things that we, again, kind of take for granted now, but are still relatively new in terms of our cultural prerogatives. So we have this exercise movement, we have this physical culture movement, and in another world, we have the scientific study of the human body. You do a really good job of bringing those two things together. When did you start doing that? How did you start doing that? It seems like that is a lot of what Move Your DNA is.
Oh gosh. I mean, it probably started in graduate school because that's when you get to really flesh out your unique ideas, right, for your thesis. And what I was most interested in as I was going through school was I was interested in culture and movement, because it's clear if you've traveled a lot that while there are similar threads of movement behavior, there are also vastly different movement behaviors. And then I also I came up personally through the exercise community outside of, it's really hard because kinesiology is by definition the study of human movement, and biomechanics falls under the umbrella of kinesiology in most cases, or exercise science, whatever the department is called. Yet it's not really the study of human movement, it's the study of exercise. So out of all of the movements that humans do throughout the world, exercise, it's a very odd thing to do.
Versus standing and walking and kind of the basic or essential human movements.
Yeah, like if you looked at, someone who lived in a population or in an area where movement was required for living, like if you had to commute somewhere by foot, you had to go get your water, you had to gather your food and physically prepare your food. All of these movements, they're not even on our radar because human movement has been outsourced to pretty much everything that you look around right now. Like if I'm looking around and you can see clothes that outsources the movements of the small muscles that regulate your body temperature. And I see a suitcase, right? So I don't have to carry things in my arms. I can just grasp my hands and drag my load of things behind me. Everything in your life, for the most part, is part of this movement, if you will, to outsource your physical experience of moving. And that is what is missing in the study of human movement. All we really know about movement is this thing that we do in the middle of our almost entirely sedentary life, right? It's like you're just flatlining as far as if I had an accelerometer on you, which is something that we would use to measure the amount of forces your whole body experiences as you move, it would be flatlining, just 0, 0, 0. I'm podcasting right now, 0. I'm writing on my computer, 0, 0. It's like exercise. You go out and do something really hard for an hour, and then you go back to flatlining. But because those who participate in exercise, fare oftentimes better than those who don't, the field of movement is focused on this hour that is what humans do, right? Isn't that what humans do? We exercise. Good humans, healthy humans exercise for this hour of a day. And so it's just an example of a science being created out of a cultural bias or being influenced, because you can't really do science above the culture in which the people doing it live. So like the fact that movement is different from exercise is not a particularly is it complex? Perhaps, because as I'm explaining it to people, it's kind of like a little mind explosions, a little bit like, what? But at the same time, it's pretty easily definable. If a part of you is moving, that's movement. It does not have to be done in an exercise context to qualify as movement. It's movement by geometrical definition.
Sure. I think that's a big part of what the paleo movement, not to confuse the phrases there, but what is trying to be expressed or emphasized is that walking more in general throughout the day should be a goal. Getting up and standing and moving around, maybe having a standing or walking workstation or something along those lines. Incorporate that. And is there a tangible, you do X and you get Y? Maybe not, but just like sleeping 8 solid hours, general body movement seems to be healthful and positive. Then what you've done, and again, I want to tie it into your book, is taking that and really sort of described it very specifically. So I might know I should get as much walking in as possible throughout the day. I wear a pedometer. I try to take around 10,000 steps. That seems to be a generally advised goal based on people looking at movement patterns of people that are healthy and how much do they walk, et cetera. So I might think of it like that. But then you're taking this cellular detail level knowledge and layering that on top of these kind of general recommendations to walk 10,000 steps or to maybe stand more often than you sit and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about where those specific explanations of recommendations that you elucidate in Move Your DNA, how you came to those ideas and how you, I guess, went about describing them the way that you did?
Well, it comes from this. So there's this idea that movement is better than not. Where that comes from is the research that shows that there's a cellular change in response to exercise. There are different cellular responses to movement. And so the fact that individual cells adapt is now understood to be via a process called mechanotransduction. So mechanotransduction is the cell itself, by being moved, by being physically distorted, that the cytoskeleton itself can communicate directly with the nucleus and create some sort of physical and or behavioral change, whether it's in the number or the function of the mitochondria or a modification. I don't know if modification is the right word, like an epigenetic effect.
There's some signaling, communication in the cell?
Yes, there's some sort of behavioral or physical adaptation to this physical, I call it a squish in the book, right? Because if you think of your cells like balloons, they're being deformed. When you load them, when you squeeze them, when you pull one end away from each other, when you grab the ends and you twist, all of those are motions. And the response of the cell depends on, one, that it gets that motion, that it senses that motion, and also, two, possibly, that the way that it's deformed affects its behavior. So there's that. So the response to exercise is on a cellular level. That's been measured. What is just now being understood is when you move, you're going to go out and take a walk. You have your pedometer on. Your pedometer is not really counting 10,000 steps. It's counting 10,000 jolts.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
So it's measuring how many times your whole body. So we're back to that entry level classic biomechanics model where the body is just a little robot body with a dot in the pelvis with a single
bopping around
line with a W weight. Right. And it's just going like that what the whole body is doing, all parts of the body is doing. And so because that is the way that we teach biomechanics, that has led people to a particular way of thinking that if my whole body is getting some amount of exercise, walking or whatever, that every one of the trillions of smaller bodies that make that up are also gathering that benefit. And so there's a large section in Move Your DNA that's trying to help explain that when you have adaptations to behaviors, a lot of that adaptation, again, documented adaptation, like say you wear a positive heeled shoe. So I imagine that a lot of people listening to this wear minimal shoes, but say you've been wearing a positive heeled shoes for decades before you transition to a minimal shoe. There's a structural adaptation within your body that geometrically prevents some of your cells from participating in your walk, even though your whole body is going across the ground. Even though I can graph that out biomechanically, what's missing from that graph are the clumps of cells that continue to be sedentary, even though the whole body could be plotted as active.
Right.
That if you're going to measure the benefit of movement on a cellular basis, you also have to measure the participation of the cells in that movement. And I think that's what I do fairly well, is to help people just by checking different things like their ranges of motion. It's not so much in Move Your DNA because the ability to assess yourself is so complex because you're very sneaky and you can move in multiple planes that it's hard to say, hey, everyone, do a forward bend, touch your toes to see how tight your hamstrings are. And then unbeknownst to them, their thigh bones rotate slightly into each other and they're able to execute a motion where their torso moves closer to the floor, but large hunks of cells in their body were not deformed in participating that particular movement because the body also has this other program constantly trying to conserve energy.
Exactly.
That's running. And so it's totally natural for you to adapt to what you do most frequently, which is nothing, and then carry that nothing's moving adaptation into your bout of exercise where the whole body is jumping, relative to the ground. And then what's interesting to me, again, with this interest in how culture influences science, is to see the rationalization of, elastic. So there's a lot of this idea, like, look how much free motion you get in running. Like you can get, this elastic leap, so you can get power and you can get speed and you don't have to give any energy for doing it, right? So it's this conservation. If you use the tendons, your Achilles tendon, like a spring, you took biomechanics, there's not a metabolic cost. You don't have to use your calf muscles to get your Achilles tendon to load and then snap back into position. But that adaptation that allowed that elasticity to develop was wearing shoes. And at the end of the day, the movement within your body that is pushing your cells around is the contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscle. So it's just really interesting to see like this kind of like, oh, we're going to get our movement for free. And it's like, you're already getting most of your movement for free. That's the problem. That's the metabolic problem. You are moving around, expending very little energy, and then now you have a metabolic condition, and now you're even trying to make it the norm model, right? You read an anatomy and a physiology textbook, and you're really reading a modern Northern American body textbook, the shapes
body.
Of the bones and it's, and like that's not human anatomy. That is a very small group of humans who live up in a particular way anatomy.
One of the big takeaways I got from that whole kind of point you just made, and this is something that I took away from listening to the audio version of your book, was that you really do have to work everything. You really can't just assume if I do this one thing, running, for example, I'm kind of checking all my movement boxes. That you do need to do some hang time and play on some monkey bars. You need to do some climbing and doing some varied movements to really get all the little parts, get all the little pieces, get all the little cells kind of down at their basic level if you want to get the full benefit.
Well, that's one point. I mean, that's basic exercise science, is this idea of cross-training, right? So you can't just consume one movement mode,
right?
Because when you become strong in one thing, you become weaker in everything else. So on one hand, that is what I'm saying. But on the other hand, what I'm saying is your need for cross-training is much broader than you could possibly imagine. It's not about playing with the 1 or 2 hours a day and going, but look at my exercise. Like I do this exercise, it's got 12 different things. It's like when you are capable of trillions and trillions of possible joint configurations and loads, and you're doing 12 of them, that's still almost zero. Like, I don't even really care what people do for their 1 hour. It's what they're doing all of the other hours that's of importance to me. It's how you're taking your rest. It's all of the other time. It's like the same thing with nutrition. It's like, what you eat one meal once a month is not as important to how you're consuming and what you're consuming throughout a month.
And kind of taking that analogy further, every moment we're consuming movement or the lack of movement. So if you go for a walk, you're consuming a walk for that hour. And then if you sit down, you're consuming sedentarism for that hour. If you do a bench press, et cetera, et cetera. And you mentioned some of the other aspects of our daily life. Taking movement out of the gym, bringing it into all aspects of our lives. You mentioned in your book how you transitioned to basically sleeping on the floor. And that being one simple thing that we really oftentimes don't think about because our beds have just become so comfortable that we don't really have to think about the way that we sleep. We just kind of plop down. It's almost like a horizontal lazy boy, I guess, with so much cushioning and propping up our necks, our backs, and our bodies in a way that's tantamount to propping up our arches with a really structured positive heel shoe or a modern running shoe. So we get some of the same issues in other areas of our life when we start to look at sleeping and standing, the same way that we might look at walking and walking shoes.
Well, I think that, again, probably most of your listeners are just familiar with this idea that the foot has not only the capability of, but the requirement for quite a bit of motion, and that the resultant foot that you get from doing that is quite integral to the function of the rest of your body. We're talking about your ankles and your knees and your hips. They are too affected by what your foot does and does not do. So if you have that model in your head about, hey, this part of my body should be able to do all of this movement and should have the habit of doing all of this movement, the same goes for your entire body. So I talk about the shoe as a cast, but there are many, many casts that we put on every day, but because you've been putting them on since birth, and then you hand them down to your children, and your children have been putting them on since birth, you don't really even recognize the effect that those casts have on your body. So shoes is one of them. A mattress is also one of them. A pillow. They are things that we were given initially that we didn't need, that we adapted to needing. So in the same way, if you've always worn a stiff heeled shoe, the foot starts collapsing out of weakness, and then you need an orthotic or some sort of support because it's uncomfortable to move around without that. Well, if you take your mattress away, you're going to be uncomfortable for a long period of time because you are not strong enough or mobile enough to deal with those forces. There's more to it than just, again, there's transition. The same way you don't throw your shoes out, you don't have to throw your mattress and your pillow out. But
Right. We don't want to scare anybody who's listening and they're freaking out. Oh, I got to sleep on the floor.
But also, as you mentioned at the beginning, the ground, everything is flat and level. Like how much flat and level do you think is natural? Yet your whole body, all of your joints have adapted to what I call vitamin flat and level. It's everywhere. Vitamin texture is nowhere in your diet to be found besides some rare, holiday hiking thing that you do. Even if you're in minimal shoes, you're still consuming a highly unnatural nutrient, if you will. It's something that's man-made and rare. It's an outlier, if you will, for what should be a regular input into the human, what cellularly you should be experiencing.
Now, we've touched on some really big but also very detailed issues. I think we've given people a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure there's some heads out there that are spinning. What are your top 3 takeaways? Let's say somebody is listening to this and they're like, I am all mixed up now. I think that I have to, really change things, but I'm not exactly sure what I should be changing. What are your suggestions for that person?
Oh, first suggestion is probably walk as much as you can. And I met a guy, or a big paleo guy, and he's like, I don't walk, I sprint everywhere. I'm a sprinter. And he was feeling that sprinting was just a faster, better version of walking. And I was trying to explain to them that they're two completely different categories of nutrients. And it finally led me to shouting. Walking is the equivalent to fat in your diet in terms of the abundance it should make up of the total calories that you consume. So I assume that most of your listeners are aware of the role dietary fat plays in health. Walking is exactly the same. A day and a week and a lifetime of a human, walking would be the thing that you would be doing the most of. And it is probably the thing that you are doing the least of.
Yeah.
So the mismatch of that nutrient is the greatest. So to start walking, easy. That's like super easy. If your head is exploded,
nice.
Just walk over and pick it up and then keep going. What would it be another takeaway? Can we talk about squatting for a couple seconds? Squatting, even if you just squat, and I'm not talking about a workout kind of squat. Squatting.
We're not talking about maxing out.
No, I'm not. Because again, we're talking about what would be the natural frequency and type of a squat. Have you got to the squatting section of Move Your DNA yet?
I have, and I spend quite a bit of time kind of just doing other things in a squat position as a result.
Right. Yes, and I think that's what it is. Like living in a squat is totally different than doing 3 sets of 10 squats with a lot of weight on your back. You know what? How about eliminating the use of your furniture for a week? Try not using your furniture for 30 days.
Oh.
7 days. Start with 7 days.
Mind blown.
And what you're going to find is you have to sit somewhere. So now all of a sudden you're squatting down to and away from the floor. You're going to end up doing that 40 more times than you normally would. And it's not about a form as much as, you think of squat form. And the reason form exists is because we are so weak, we have to figure out how to do our high intensity moves in a way that doesn't hurt us, as opposed to if you were doing 700 squats a day because you're getting down and you're coming back up and you're crouching and you're crawling through and you're picking, kids and things up off of the ground, that your feet and your knees and your hips are going to be at all different angles every time you come up and come down, thus cross-training every possible way that you can use your feet and your knees and your hips together functionally. So try that. That would be another thing.
So walk as much as possible everywhere and do a furniture-free experiment.
Yes.
Cool.
And then just minimal shoes. I assume that everyone is in minimal shoes. And if you are not, get there ASAP.
I still don't see as many minimal shoes. You know, when Vibrams first kind of hit and people started becoming aware of them, I thought in a matter of time, everyone's going to be wearing these things. But I think that the fashion aspect, or the fact that they're not that fashionable, perhaps, I guess, from some people's perspective, has impaired the adoption of them. And I'd like to spend just a minute, because we're going a little bit over here, but the fear that has been put out there that if I transition to minimal shoes, I'm going to get hurt. I heard about all these people wearing Vibram Five Fingers blowing out their Achilles tendons or getting plantar fasciitis.
I don't think the hype of minimal shoes ended up doing minimal shoe movement justice. Right. I think that it became a very polarizing thing. And I think that both sides, I think that it became one of those things like,
dug their proverbial heels in. It
was just like, if you get rid of your shoes, your whole body is going to be healthier for it. So just throw them away right now. And then, of course, you have the reactive. If you do that, you're going to have fractures in your foot and shin splints and plantar fasciitis. And I wrote a whole separate book after Move Your DNA on transitioning to minimal footwear, because I found that there was so much to the argument and to explain how they really are a whole body thing, and that the transition could take up to a couple of years, that I hope that helps, because I believe that the optimal wellness that you are seeking can be thwarted by what you put on your feet every single day. But I do think that there needs to be a transition, in the same way that you don't get up and do a marathon after 30 years of sitting only on the couch, jumping into minimal shoes after wearing footwear for 30 or 40 years. You have structurally adapted to that, and it does not turn off just because you decided to change what was on your feet that day. So those would be the three things that I think that you would radically improve both the quantity and the quality of the movement on your cells, on all trillion of your bodies. Nice.
Don't forget that other trillion cells.
Yeah, you are one body fashioned out of a trillion smaller bodies, and the more we can keep talking to the trillion of you instead of the one of you, this will all make more sense.
Awesome. Well, hey, Katie, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. I really think that we need to do special 2-hour podcasts or 3-hour podcasts to really try to capture everything. But I guess that's why you have your own podcasts and books and DVDs and things like that, so that people can really tap into this wealth of information that you have. If people want to check out your website, it's katiesays.com. I highly, highly, highly recommend the book, Move Your DNA. And if you're like me, I think the audiobook is awesome because you can walk as you listen, which is something that you specifically recommend.
I plan it that way. I give you your mile markers, and it's like a 20 miles, right? Isn't it like the whole book is worth 20 miles if you're a fast walker, more, but on average 20 miles just for listening to, why you should be walking, etc.
It's awesome. Well, hey, thanks again for coming on the show. I really think that this is important information, looking at exercise and movement from a much more nuanced perspective, to really try to kind of get past the hype, I guess, and to be thinking a little bit more deeply about why we're moving and why it's important to keep moving.
Well, thanks, Tony, for having me. I appreciate it.
If you want to find out more about Katie, go to her blog, katiesays.com. You can find her books, podcast, blog posts, everything you need to know about movement. It's on there. It's a great resource. Coming up next, we've got Russ Crandall. We're going to chat about Paleo Takeout. I'm Tony Federico. You are listening to PMR. Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of The Ancestral Table with our good friend Russ Crandall, author of The Ancestral Table, for which this segment is named. But I don't know, we might have to change the segment to Paleo Takeout with Russ Crandall. Welcome back to the show, man.
Thanks for having me on.
So obviously your new book, Paleo Takeout, is on everybody's minds, and we talked about it the last time you were on the show, just from a big picture perspective, kind of going over the theme of the book, how you came up with the idea, how you actually went about making it. It was quite an ambitious project. So I wanted to dive deep into a specific recipe, because I think that it really represents something that most people on a paleo diet have completely written off. It's a classic. I don't know if it's an Italian classic, but it's certainly an American version of an Italian food, spaghetti and meatballs.
Yeah, you see that out there in a lot of paleo blogs. I think a lot of people, when they first start doing paleo, that's one thing that they try to do. But I got to say, man, the way that I made these spaghetti and meatballs is like kind of the best. Like,
not to toot your own horn or anything.
Yeah.
This is the winning recipe.
When I hit it, and I got this one right, I remember my wife, she took the first bite and she's just like, she goes, I'm kind of in love with these meatballs. And my wife is always critical. Like every time she's like, oh, I need a little salt or whatever. And it's not because she's like overly, but it's because I like to hear that stuff. You know what I mean? I don't want someone to say, oh, it's good. I want to hear, okay, why is it not the best thing you've ever had? And so she didn't have anything bad to say about this one. So that's pretty awesome. Man.
Yeah. So it was wife approved right out of the gate. Now walk us through the process of making these. What makes these the best ever?
So I think the best thing about them is that it's this combination of when to add the ingredients together at the right time and how much to process each little thing and then how to cook it the right way too. So let's go through just kind of step by step. So first step is you want to take some egg yolks and a little bit of chicken broth and the recipe's in the book, so I'm not going to give everything away, but you put these egg yolks and chicken broth together with a little bit of gelatin powder. What gelatin does when you add it to meatballs is it adds this really nice smooth texture to them. So it's very similar to why people like to use veal when they make meatballs is because the collagen that's in veal from the young cow is still very young and kind of vibrant, and so it makes these really tender and succulent meatballs. But you can get that same approach by adding gelatin, which is basically what comes from collagen,
Any specific advice with regards to gelatin powder? I know that it can come in a couple different forms. Which is the one that you recommend for this recipe?
So you'd want to use the one that actually like solidifies, like the one that makes Jell-O,
Okay. So not like I think it's the hydrolyzed is the one that is sort of, you just kind of mix it in water, but it doesn't really firm up.
Exactly. So you want the one that actually you usually would add to hot liquid and then make it to, turn into Jell-O basically.
Yep. So standard gelatin, and maybe a Great Lakes is one variety that a lot of people are familiar with. Vital Proteins is another one. So either of those would work.
Proteins, a good one. Yep, absolutely. And I think we used Vital Proteins when we made it.
Cool.
So you set that aside, and then you basically get everything that you're going to mix into the meat itself. So you get together, onions and fresh parsley, some garlic, a little bit of pepper, and a little bit of tapioca starch too, which gives it a little bit of bounciness, but not much, like a tablespoon. And then salt. You throw all that in a food processor and you just chop the living daylight out of it, right? So you get it like really kind of a paste, and that's really great for people like me who don't like to bite into pieces of onion, So it's just really chopped up pretty finely. And then you add a little bit of Parmesan cheese, and if you're not eating cheese, that's fine. You can omit it. And then some bacon, right? So of course you're going to add bacon to meatball.
Because bacon.
Right. And so it also gets chopped up like that, not as much as all the other ingredients, but it does get chopped up enough so that when you bite into the meatball, you're like, oh, this is bacony, but not to the point where you're like, think that you're eating bacon. So you get all that together, and that's basically all of your mix-ins. And then you take your meat out of the refrigerator, and so I like to do half pork, half beef, and then you basically minimally mix them into these really large balls, like the size of almost tennis balls. From there, you throw them into the oven and you broil them. So you're just broiling them from the top, right? And you're just getting the tops nice and brown. And then you transfer them over into a big pot of marinara or, spaghetti sauce. And you basically let them sit there, you cover it, and you just let them cook for about 10 more minutes until they're cooked through. And then just very gently cooking. So you get this meatball that's got this really crisp texture to it on the top, as well as this like just succulent inside, and then you serve it over whatever noodle you like. So you could use rice noodles or sweet potato noodles, or you can use spiralized sweet potato or spiralized zucchini, however you want to do it. I have a lot of different interpretations in the book, but that's basically it. It's that perfect meatball.
And what's your personal pick for the best accompaniment for this meatball? What kind of paleo pasta do you defer to?
We usually do one of two things. If we're feeling like a really full meal, then we usually will do like rice spaghetti. And they make spaghetti that's just basically rice, flour, and water. But then if it's like a summer day and something and we want kind of a lighter meal, then we always do spiralized zucchini, which you basically just run through that spiralizer thing, and then you just dip it in boiling water for about 20 seconds and pull it out, and then you just kind of squeeze about half the liquid out of it, and then it's ready to go at that point, basically. And it's good. It's like a spaghetti salad kind of thing. It's really kind of a neat experience. Yeah.
Cool, man. And one of the things we were talking about before we hit record was when you're putting the meatball together, and I think this is an area where a lot of people go wrong, you don't want to overwork the meat. Can you give us a couple pointers on making sure that you kind of take more of a hands-off approach and how you can form the ball without getting it all kind of jacked up with too much kneading and too much hands-on?
Right. So the process to make an Italian meatball is totally different than like an Asian meatball. And so in an Asian meatball, you want to basically throw the meat into the processor and you just want to run it until it gets really tacky and pasty, because it comes out really kind of springy and bouncy, but also pretty dense, But the good true measurement of an Italian meatball is it not being dense, And so the trick to that is you just want to minimally touch the ground beef and the ground pork to the point where you're basically just kind of mixing them together. Like you should be like nervous touching it, you know what I mean? To the point where you're like, oh, I don't want to touch this too much, because all those proteins and everything that's within there, all the connective tissue, it starts to fall apart when you start to mess with it like that. And so you really don't want to mess with it too much.
And keeping it cold, I think, was another point that you made, as far as you don't want your ground meat products especially to sit out and get too warm before you start cooking them.
Right, and that's the opposite too. You think, oh well, you leave steak out to room temperature before you roast it or before you fry it or grill it or whatever, and that definitely works when you're using an unadulterated piece of beef, But when you're using ground beef or ground pork, you want to keep them cold, right? Because then it'll start to kind of fall apart as well when it's at room temperature. So you really want to keep it together, keep it connected, and the best thing to do is to keep it cold right before you cook it, basically.
This really kind of parallels hamburger making technique in many ways. And I guess anytime, whether it's a ball or a burger, anytime you're kind of doing a ground meat product, when I was looking into some of the top opinions on the penultimate hamburger, how to actually go about doing that, they all really advocate this, low, don't fool around with it, just kind of barely press the meat together. They're even recommending using a cast iron skillet to cook it if you're going to grill it, so you don't have to worry about it falling through. And I put this kind of cluster of techniques to the test. Recently did a ground short rib burger. I kind of just, how would I say? I suggested that it go into the form of a burger. I was just like, hey guys, why don't you just kind of get together in a couple of patties and see how this goes. But I have to say, man, the ultimate product, the end result of just kind of having a nice, almost crumbly texture and a lot of air in it, and really just kind of falling apart. It really made it nice, and that was for me a wife approved recipe. So I can imagine doing this kind of in a larger scale with a larger tennis ball sized meatball. That's got to be pretty awesome too. So I'm excited for trying this recipe out, man. And obviously with a name like Federico, anytime you can kind of harken back to some sort of Italian food that I've given up, you certainly have won me over. So appreciate you breaking down the recipe, man. And then again, I wish you continued success with the book, and hopefully we'll hear more about it as the future unfolds.
Cool. Thanks, Tony.
All right, Paleo Nation, that's going to do it for today's episode. Coming up next time on the podcast, Paul Jaminet, author of The Perfect Health Diet. He traveled all the way to Germany to go to their very first paleo convention. So Paul came back and he shared with us right here on Paleo Magazine Radio his experience going to Germany and where the paleo movement in Germany is right now. Here's a clip.
It reminds me of like the first Paleo FX. It's like everything's really exciting and there's a ton of volunteers and everybody's really excited to, work together, build something up. I think Paleo in Germany is right about at that stage.
To find out more about Paul's trip to Germany, the new Perfect Health Diet themed restaurant that they're opening up, and all the exciting stuff that's going on with Perfect Health Retreat, you're going to have to tune into next week's episode. To make sure that you do that, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. And while you're there, if you leave a comment and rate/review us, it really helps. It helps us to get out in front of new listeners. So if you like the show, it's an easy way for you to show your support. And if you don't like the show, you can give us some feedback. So until next time, I'm Tony Federico, and on behalf of everyone at Paleo Magazine, thank you for listening.
If you would like to share your story on PMR, please visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Paleo Magazine. For full transcripts of the show, as well as exclusive online content, go to our webpage, paleomagonline.com. You can also talk to us on Twitter at #PMRadio.